Hello, everybody, and welcome to an episode in Season 2 of Undercooled. We are very happy to be back with you. Steve and I are just going to be having a conversation today about why we keep making work for ourselves, and once we do, what do we do about it? So that's our theme, but in particular, each of us is doing something pretty new in the teaching space, and that's going to be a recurring topic throughout the season as we visit these classes as they flow in real time, and we can break down what happens, the good and the bad and the ugly, and share that all with you. So this is the first round of that semester-long project.
So Tim, what crazy project are you doing this term?
Well, I failed to say no, and now I am developing and launching and teaching mathematical methods for material science. It'll be a sophomore level math class for our MSc majors to teach them the things that they need in order to succeed in their upper level coursework.
That's a lot. Have you ever taught a math course before?
Well, I taught AP Calculus 15 years ago. That went
Oh,
fine.
there you go. You have some experience. In fact, I'd argue that you have more experience than anyone in our whole department then.
Well, we'll see how that experience does for me. But what about on your side? I know you have some pretty big teaching plans for this semester. What's on your plate?
So I'm once again teaching Introduction to Material Science and Engineering. But I've been since 2013 trying to teach this as a team-based, project-based course instead of as a lecture course. And that's been quite the journey. I give a lot of credit and thanks to my friend Eric Mazur, who has helped me tremendously with this, and also to you, Tim, you're a phenomenal sounding board, because I know you've studied all these different kinds of pedagogies. But as you know, theory is one thing. Actually doing it is a radically different thing. So in my quest to try to make this happen, I learned last term that my students weren't learning. And they were, doing everything I asked them to do. And as a result, I was giving them A's. But when I walked around the room and actually talked to them, it was very apparent that they were gaming the system. They were doing everything I asked, but they weren't learning the material at the level I was expecting them to learn. So I was very depressed. It killed me over the winter break. And as fate would have it, a new book got published in January that I knew was coming out, but I didn't know was coming out then, by Robert Talbert and David Clark, who are math professors at Grand Valley State here in Michigan. And wow, that book really helped me create a vision for how to reinvent this class to make sure people actually learned. So I've decided to make a pretty major change in the way I teach. And of course, now that I'm in the details of actually doing it, it's a lot of work. And so I think I'm almost ready, which is good, because when do classes start? Next week?
Very, very soon.
A week from Monday. Yeah,
A week from Monday.
What a great motivator. So that's what I've been doing. So how are you approaching all of this, Tim? And how are you dealing with the crush of and the demands of having something credible to talk to your students about a week from Monday?
Yeah. Well, you and I in the last year really have talked a lot about really what our goals for our classes are. What are the student outcomes? What are the learning objectives? What can students do to actually demonstrate that they learn something? And coming out of that ongoing conversation, I really started this course with laying out what the course objectives are. And that's different from defining what the topics are. So that distinction is really important. I didn't start by saying, I'm going to teach linear algebra and I'm going to teach probability. I started by saying, what will a successful student have that they can do that prepared them for success in their upcoming classes? And to define that, I started with, what are the upcoming classes? So I talked to our juniors, I talked to our seniors, and I said, what math do you actually use in kinetics, in 420 structural materials, in physical metallurgy, whatever it is? And I started categorizing all of the things that students had to be able to do mathematically to succeed in those courses. That was how I started this class. And then once I had that list of students will be able to, then I said, okay, what are learning outcomes that support that successful performance? And then, gradually work backward. How will I assess it? Okay, if I'm going to assess it this way, how am I going to teach it? And then finally say, what topic should I actually cover? But the topics are really the last thing. That's almost the seasoning. It's not the structure of the dish.
That's interesting. That's really different than my problem. I'm teaching a course that we've agreed has to already have the content that's in Callister.
Right.
It's interesting. We had our North American Materials Education Symposium last week, and Bill Callister showed up, and he promptly told me that I've been mispronouncing his name all these years. I always thought it was Callister, but he
I
said,
think
"Oh,
everyone
no.
does.
Yeah, it's Callister. Like, call him Callister." And so talking to Bill was really a lot of fun because I wanted to talk to him about this whole approach of creating standards. We have our micro standards, which are the outcomes that we generate for each class session, whether that be a lecture or a team-based activity. And in the early days of doing this, as I'm sure you remember, people made 12 outcomes per lecture. And we realized that's absurd. That's just way too much. And we all got them down to 5 to 8 statements of things we thought students should be able to learn from this class session. And but this book that I read, that Robert Talbert wrote with David Clark, really made me challenge that. And I already had the problem. So I had already had a reflective piece. So just to recap quickly, I have students read the book for the first introduction of the material using perusal. They get lots of feedback from each other. They can keep taking it keep making annotations as many times as they want, whatever. So they come to class actually knowing something. And in class, we give them activities. It's like a giant recitation. We tell them if it's right or wrong, and we help them, but we don't grade it. It's an ungraded assignment. We only require they show up. Then they do homework, and we've always given homework where I don't grade the homework for accuracy, just for effort. But then they turn the homework in on Canvas, and then I give them time in class to sit with their team and make a better homework solution set while we walk around and help them. So again, lots of feedback, lots of opportunities to understand how to actually do it. Then my solutions drop, and the next class or the next 2 classes, they turn in their reflection, which consists of marking up their document, circling things in blue. If it's a math error or algorithmic error, they have to correct it. And then they circle something in red if it was a conceptual error that they didn't really know how to even attack the problem, they used the wrong set of equations, really didn't understand the boundary conditions, whatever it was. And then they had to write a short reflection about that. How did they overcome those barriers? Who helped them? And do they still need help? And then I grade that for honesty. And we have a little 2-part quiz. I call it a readiness assurance activity because it came from the team-based learning community. It's a very old technique. So you give a summative quiz, but machine gradable, so they can do it on a computer where they answer questions, and we don't give them any feedback. We don't tell them if it's right or wrong. They just have to do it, and they do it in silence. They do it closed book, closed notes, closed everything. But what's different is right after that period closes, that's the individual round, we then give the exact same quiz to their team. And now they can talk to their team members. They can see their original answers so they can compare. It's open book, open internet. They can use artificial intelligence. I don't care. We have our team walking around, helping them, giving them hints, because the idea is it's a learning experience. They should learn how to do the exam. They should get 100. And then we average those two scores for their grade. And all that's great. But what was bothering me was I wasn't finding that they were learning. And I thought it was because of the same thing that happens with all the literature on exams, right? People have studied exams. And the reason exams don't really drive learning is that students cram for it. They do the exam, and then 2 weeks later, they had forgotten everything because psychologists have
They
told
don't
us
study
along.
for retention. They study
Right.
for a moment of performance.
Yep. And it's all about getting this stuff into long-term memory so they can retain it much, much longer. And that's where reflections come in. Reflections are a good way to have students revisit the material near the end of a module where you introduce it, do work, do homework, do quizzes, whatever. And so it extends that period. They have to revisit it and think about it. And so I made them write a reflection, providing me evidence that they had met one of the outcomes on the Monday class and one of the outcomes on the Wednesday class, because it was just too much to have them do all of it. But in reading that book, his 4 pillars start with having clear standards. And he explains that standards are not as fine-grained as outcomes. They're also more fine-grained than course outcomes. It's something in between. So it's the course outcomes are like micro standards. I'm sorry, the lecture or the session outcomes are like micro standards. The course outcomes are like macro standards. These are meso standards. And you want to make sure that there's not too many. And in thinking about this, and also in talking to you, Tim, I realized that everything we do in engineering, there are conceptual things we want students to learn, the concepts, but there are also problem-solving skills that we want our students to learn as well. And they're very different. They feed into each other, they amplify each other, but they're different. So I thought maybe I can come up with one statement that describes the conceptual underpinning of an entire chapter or an entire week of work, and one statement describing the kinds of problems they should be able to do.
Yep.
And then I can have them reflect on both of them, and that'll grab everything. So that's one of the things that I'm starting to work on. So I guess because I already had my topics and because I already had this whole class structure, my job's a little easier than yours. But because the class is so big and there's so many moving parts, it's all those details that make it difficult for me. And I'll tell you more about that later. But I want to
Right.
hear how. So now you have your topics. I presume you have a whole outline of what you're going to teach, right?
Yep. We've
So
got the
what's the
syllabus
next?
with the day-by-day fine-grained outcomes. But I do also have, very similar to what you're describing, I have these sort of weekly standards of here is the overall concept of this week. Because math is very conceptual as well. Or at least it should be if you really understand it. But there is also that just operational fluency of I can execute this calculation. And I do want students to have those two sides of that understanding as well, as that they'll say, this is what this math means, this is what it's for, this is when it's useful, but then also procedurally, here's how I do it. And so I'm really approaching each bit of content from addressing those two perspectives. But the thing that's on my side is this is a smaller class for majors, so they've bought in a sense already. This is my stuff. I have to learn it. I don't really have to sell it. I need to motivate it. I need to say why this math is important and why it's useful and how you will use it in the very near future. But it's different from managing a, 100-person introductory class where you have all kinds of people from all kinds of places majoring in all kinds of things at different ages and so on. I have a much narrower population. So I got that going for me. But as far as the class itself, once I got my standards defined, what's my conceptual objectives and what are my students will be able to operational objectives, then I wanted to think about how am I going to teach this and really start getting into the pedagogical nuts and bolts of what will the student experience look like? What is their day-to-day? What kind of assessments am I going to use? Because much as we have learned over and over and over for decades that students don't study for exams in order to actually learn, we've also learned for decades and decades and decades that lecturing at students is effective at information transfer and not much else. So I'm not here to transfer information. I'm here to equip students to actually be able to do stuff. And that means that I'm approaching this class on the assessment side to mirror what you're saying. I'm doing very frequent, very low stakes assessment. So I'm having quizzes every week and they're like 15 minutes, like 2 problems probably. And, sort of an easy difficulty and a medium difficulty. There's no hard difficulty. That's on the homework because hard math gets time intensive pretty quickly. I can't give them an hour long, partial differential equations problem on a quiz. That's just not tractable. So we're having these frequent low stakes assessments. And it's interesting that yours are like open everything, because this is something I've been waffling on, is how open to make mine, to have it be real to the way that people actually use math. It has to be open something. Like you're never stuck on a desert island with a pencil inventing, calculus by yourself. You have resources, you have references. But at the same time, I do want to make sure that I'm structuring the assessments in a way that does drive students to actually try to learn something. And so I've landed on open notes, but closed internet. And what I particularly want to badger students to do over and over and over is make your own note sheet for the quiz. Right. I'm going to tell you what the topics are every single day. Make the notes that you want to have. Give yourself the breadcrumbs to follow when you see these problems. And I know when I was a student, that was so helpful for me in my physics classes where we had note sheets. That was where I actually synthesized all the information and saw, oh, that's how that equation connects to that equation, which lets you inform that other thing from that other class, was trying to put it all on one page in a coherent and referenceable way. So that is how I'm using assessment to try to actually drive learning in this class.
I'm really glad you just said that, because I agree with you. I've always thought that making you limit it to how big it can be, whether it's
right.
4x5 card or a bigger card or an 8.5 by 11. The other thing that most people do, that I certainly do, is insist that it's all handwritten.
Yes.
You don't want them to take text and shrink it.
and then they're coming in with a microfilm reader,
Exactly. But as you know, the value is in them taking notes. It's why I use perusal, because by annotating the material, you're starting to synthesize. Writing is a critical part of thinking, right? When you write it down, you realize you think, oh yeah, I understand this. And then you write it down, you go,
right.
Not sure how to say all this.
Yeah.
And so that's a good thing. And later on, I'm going to talk about that I'm giving a final exam, an optional final exam. But I had forgotten that I should probably have the students let them bring in a sheet of paper that they can write whatever they want on it, but it has to be single, I'll probably make it a, what are the next bigger size, the 3x?
Yeah, there's a 4x6
size.
And then
sort of like a quarter page.
Yeah.
And I'll have them bring in one of those with, but it has to be handwritten.
So
yeah,
what are you doing for your final exam? Let's go ahead and get
well,
into
this
that.
goes back to, again, this book. And I talked about this book in terms of standards, and that's very important. They mention in the context of how do you assess the standards and then how do you do grading. So it's all called grading for growth. And when Robert Talbert was here talking to us a year before he published the book, he actually told a little story I thought was great. He said his kid is on the swim team, and it's really easy to grade his kid with swimming. You know, his kid's like 7 or 12 or whatever it is. And, you know, here's the 100-meter, swimming event. Here's the world record and what the Olympics do, right? That's the goal. But nobody expects a 12-year-old to be able to do that, right?
Right.
It takes time. And so the marks you get are meaningful, right? They tell you, what's your time? And you see what your time is compared to people in your age group, and you know what you have to do to get better. So when you get your time, even if it may not be what you like, it's a very meaningful mark. So his 4 pillars are clear standards, lots of feedback loops in every kind of assessment, meaningful marks. And he argues that a percentage out of 100 is not very meaningful. And finally, reassessment without penalty, recognizing that we have to fail before we learn. And those are his 4 pillars. So that caused me to go back and look at every single one of my assessments that I just mentioned and ask myself, do I have clear standards for those things? Do I have feedback loops? Do I have clear marks? And do I give them chances to get reassessment? And I already had a lot of those, but not everywhere. So my reading with perusal, tons of feedback because other students constantly annotate your annotations. So it's an asynchronous discussion of the book. So that's lots of feedback. Plus, the grades are updated every hour. And if they're not doing well, they can add more annotations that are more thoughtful and raise their score. So there's lots of reassessment without penalty. And then the marks are very simple. It's a 0, 1, or 2. 2 is satisfactory. 1 is it's getting there, but you need more work. And I give them lots of feedback on how to do that. I tell them if they're having trouble, come see me and I'll help them make better annotations. But I go one step further. I write down a set of reading questions, which are things that they should be able to answer because they're coupled to all my fine-grained outcomes. And they can just find the parts in the book that answer those questions. And then they can write about why that part of the book answered those questions. One thing that's interesting in perusal to combat AI, they have a new switch you can throw. You can cause perusal not to accept any text that somebody wants to paste into the window. So students have to physically type it. So even if they want to cheat, at least they're going to retype it, which is a lot better than just cutting and pasting. Your comment about transferring information in lectures reminded me of something that Eric used to say in his talks. He said, in a lecture, information goes from the page of notes that the professor has to the whiteboard or blackboard and directly into the notepads of the students without ever going through the minds of either the teacher or the student. It's just an information transfer. So your comment was very much like that. So anyway, that's, I have lots of feedback, lots of, so for all of these things, I looked at it. And there were a few places where I always had lots of feedback. So even these RAAs, because it's this 2-part exam, they get together, they talk about it. We have our instructional team come around and we ask them to do their problems on the whiteboard so we can see how they're doing and we can deploy our staff to where it's needed. They get lots of feedback before they turn in their final answer. And then that's where I had a problem, because there was no way to give them reassessment without penalty. And so what I thought I would do, last year, again, my biggest mistake was I set the team-based round for the RAAs at 85% and the individual round at 15%. What a terrible mistake. What an idiot I was. You know, it just caused students to do nothing to prepare. And they just all relied on someone who was smart on the team, and they never learned anything.
Right, just showed up ready to be carried.
Yeah, so now it's going to be 50%. So even if the team, and also to make the marks meaningful, I set a threshold that they have to pass to get a satisfactory on the RAA. So my marks for the RAA, I want to be satisfactory, needs revision, or a 0. And to make the distinction of what's satisfactory, I decided a B+ is satisfactory. And I made it that way because it's going to be hard to get an A in the class. So to get an A in the class, you're going to have to get a certain, like 90% of the RAAs, you have to get a satisfactory on. So I think by doing that, I'm making the marks more meaningful. It's a pass, no pass. But because it's 50-50 averaging the team and the individual, to get an 87.5, you need a 75 if your team gets 100. So I'm setting the individual bar to a C, which is not a very high bar, but these quizzes are kind of tough. I use multiple selection, and my numerical problems, there's 0 partial credit. There's something really wonderful about not giving partial credit. Partial credit.
It's funny you say that, because I was just thinking about how I'm grading the problems in my class, and we should do an entire episode on just how we're grading these classes. There's enough there.
Well, that's my whole revamp, is all the grading.
Yeah.
But I agree.
On the partial credit topic, I'm planning to score each problem out of 3 points. And each of those 3 points is, right, it's binary. It's either you did or you didn't. So 1 point is your answer correct? These are math problems. They have objective, correct solutions. The second is your conceptual approach appropriate to this problem? Yes or no? And sometimes there's more than one right way to do a problem, but if you got the right answer by dumb luck, you're not going to get the conceptually correct point. And then the third point is, did you actually try? Because you could do it completely wrong, but clearly have put in an effort beyond throwing symbols on a page and hoping for the best. And you can also get a right answer and show no work. And then I don't know if you tried or not. Right. So that's my fairly simple grading scheme that eschews partial credit entirely, but still addresses the fact that there are multiple components that go into doing a problem correctly.
Right.
But more on that another time.
Yep. So at any rate, I've got, I think, meaningful marks, but I don't have, and I have lots of feedback in the team round, but I don't have the reassessment without penalty part. Now, the book is very clear. They say not every assignment should have unlimited reassessments. For example, exams. You might give them one extra shot, but that's still a reassessment without penalty. And so what I thought I would do is if, and it's kind of funny, I think you helped me with this. If you didn't do as well as you thought you should have done on the individual part, then I would let you come and take a retest. But you'd have to come to my office hours to do it, What solves another big problem most of us have is that the only people who show up to your office hours are there to complain about what they got on a previous exam.
Right.
Instead of talking about the material, which is what we want to talk about. So I'm going to try, I'm not telling them I'm doing this, but I'm going to give them an oral exam for their retest. And then I think you pointed out, you got to be careful there. You're going to get all the, A students who want to get those extra few points.
Mm-hmm.
And so because of that, I'm only going to let people who got less than a 75% take this retest. And the logic there is they're not supposed to just get a 75%. They're supposed to learn enough to be able to help their team get 100%.
Right.
And so if the team doesn't get 100, they need a higher grade than 75 to get a satisfactory. And that's a responsibility of perhaps some of the better students. So anyway, that's what I'm going to do. Oral exams take a lot of time. I'm hoping that by doing it this way, I'm triaging the class, because who do I want to come and take these retests? I want the bottom part of my distribution to show up so I get a shot at teaching them one-on-one through an oral exam. And so if I do that, even if I'm overwhelmed and I have to back off, I'll still give them this extra shot by taking another in-class exam. In office hours exam, and I still get to talk to them. I can still go over their quiz with them. So that's what I'm trying to do there. And then the final thing, with projects, I was doing lots of feedback, but I didn't have any way to do a reassessment. So what I'm introducing this year is, if the team wants, it's optional, they can give me a draft of what their project is going to look like. But I think they need to give it to me 10 days before the due date, so they actually have a shot at taking feedback I give them, so they can actually improve it and do well. So that's sort of a mixed feedback and reassessment. So I'm doing that with that. And then finally, with the final reflection of the outcomes, I'm now going to do a standards reflection. And they're going to have to provide evidence. They'll turn it in. There's no way to give them feedback except when I get their report. And if I feel that they've just not given me good evidence, or they've done what I told them not to do, make a little expository piece about the standard, which they could have done from AI, I'm not going to challenge them, but I'll tell them this is not what I asked for. This is not satisfactory. So the reassessment is, if they get in that situation, they will have an opportunity to make a 2-minute whiteboard video explaining the standards to a freshman engineering student. And it has to be all handwritten, no cut and paste, no PowerPoint. It has to be handwritten. And if they do that and it looks good, they'll get full credit for their project. So that's how I'm doing all that.
Yeah, the timeline there of that 10 days before it's due, that's very wise. That's with lab projects especially, I've discovered that it takes the students about a week to get around to doing the revisions that I give them the feedback for, and then suddenly they do it. They start realizing, oh, wait, I don't understand what this feedback means. But then there's still that window of time to come back and to have a conversation about it. What did you mean when you wrote this on my paper? And then I read it and I'm like, what did I mean when I wrote that on your paper? But we work it out together, of course.
So, of course, the big message in this entire book is that grading is being done so arbitrarily in almost all of our disciplines. And he, points out two things that we all do that we usually even hammer our students about doing, namely precision and error bars. We ignore it completely when we do the kind of grading we do, which is compressing everything to 70 to 100 and then looking for breakpoints and making those arbitrary lines for an A or a B, whatever, where you have a break of 0.02%. Oh, whoa, that's a big, huge jump. I'll put it there. And yet we know that we can't measure learning better than 20 or 30%, plus or minus. So what are we doing? We should be smacking ourselves on our heads. And then the other thing that I knew that's old. But the thing I never appreciated was he starts his chapter by saying, take all the zip codes in a state and find the average of those numbers. What does that mean? And the answer is it doesn't mean anything. And his point is that we are so good at manipulating numbers just because they're numbers that we don't think about what it actually means. I think it takes a math professor to recognize this. And he makes the point that even though everything is represented in percent, there are underlying units that are meaningful. So a quiz will have very different units than a project. And those will have very different units than a reading assignment. They're just completely different kinds of assessments. And to take a weighted average to find your score actually makes no sense. It's not a thoughtful way to do it. So he suggests, and I'm implementing, using what's called a grading table, where it's sort of like gaming. You have to get to the C- level. And if you want to advance to the B- level, you have to do all these things. So in the table, the columns are each kind of assessment. And remember, I made each assessment scored with a meaningful mark of satisfactory or not. And so I can look down and say, the C- student, the C- is what we require for this course to be counted towards their degree. It's what's required for them to use as a prereq for a higher level course. So the C- represents the lowest score we're willing to give a student that we believe is capable of doing okay in the class that the course is required for. We need to think about that, right?
Right.
And so when I look across each category, I make independent judgments on each kind of assessment. And so, for example, I think 65% of the reading assignments getting a 2 or above, a satisfactory, they should be able to do that. That's a little more than a half, right? And if I remember back to things I've read in the literature, that if your students can actually remember only 5% of what you told them, that's pretty good. So I think getting it up to 50%, that's really good. And it's not hard to do because of the structure. And then I do the same with each one, and I come up with a C- level for each assessment. And it also gives me the opportunity to add in another column of what I call required components, like doing the CAPME team builder exercise, like doing the CAPME peer review. These things have nothing to do with learning, but it's a critical part of the course, and they just have to do them. And this puts teeth into it, because if they don't do them, because there's usually not that many of the participations in there, it's a team-based class. And so it gives me another column and another thing to get to the next level. So I do C-, then I do A-. I don't do A, I do A-, and I'll tell you why in a second. And so it normally goes from 65% to 90%. I understand they're not going to do 100%. That's okay. So if I do it like that, and that's all I did, I'd end up in the same place I was before. The only extra accountability I put into the course at this point was grading the RAA 50-50 instead of 15-85, right? So with all that work, I still haven't done anything. But then at the end of the book, he makes the case for, as evil as summative exams are, that you should give a final exam. And his point is, learning's over. The final exam's not supposed to be a learning experience. Classes are over. This happens after classes.
This
the
is the
final
measurement
exam,
of your final state at the end of the class.
well, he calls it a recertification of your learning. And so what I'm telling the students, to get an A, you have to first hit the A minus level. And you have to take the final and get a 93 or above if you want an A, and get a 90 or above if you want an A minus. And if you don't take the exam, that's okay. You'll drop down to a B plus. Or if you score below a 90, even if you get a 0, you'll get a B plus. So what have I done? I've moved my median from my median of people who don't understand anything from an A to a B plus. But I still argue that they've learned a lot by even getting to that A minus level now with this extra accountability and the RAAs. And then I talked to my GSI about this, and he made the point, well, what about people who get a, B? Shouldn't they be able to take the final? I said, that's a good point. I'm not going to let them get an A because they haven't done all the work. But what I'll let them do, it's an optional final. They don't have to take it. But if they do, and they get the score, just like with, they hit the A minus level to get an A, they need a 93. So if they got a B, they'd have to get an 87 to get a B plus. So anybody can take the final and increase their grade 1 increment. And I think that will be helpful. So I've never done this. We'll see what this works out. It's taken me a long time and a lot of thought in how to build this. I've had 2 meetings with people from CRLT, Gran Agrisar, who's fantastic. She's given me a lot of feedback. She's going to come in and do 2 MSFs, midterm student feedbacks, one early and one later, because I really want to know how this is going to work. And I'm sure she'll do the same for you, Tim. So that's what I'm trying. So that was the conceptual part. And now I'm struggling with actually putting all this crap into Canvas with, oh my God, it's so much work redoing because it's a complicated website.
Yeah, I've put off Canvas as long as possible, but it's finally time.
Yeah, it's next week.
I know.
So have you done... Well, you have a week and a weekend.
I know.
Have you done the standards for your objectives for the outcomes? I mean, for the whole course? Is that all done?
Yes. Yeah. So I do have all that laid out. That was part of my syllabus writing, was getting all that. And working out the grading scheme was also part of that.
Right.
2 things that I brought in, inspired by our discussions about these topics. I'm doing the same approach with my final exam, in that basically the final exam will be optional. If you take the final, it can increase your course grade by 1 step, B plus to A minus, that sort of thing.
Yeah,
if you do sufficiently well on the final.
That's good. So you and I can both fail at the same time.
Yes, absolutely. Not in the math class, but in my lab class. One area that I've always struggled with is getting students to just do their peer evaluations every week. And so what I'm going to do this year is, as you were just saying, that's not even a graded component of the course anymore. It is a required component of the course. If you don't do at least 90% of the peer evals, your course grade cannot exceed this letter.
Yeah.
And if you don't do at least 80% of them, your course grade cannot exceed this letter, regardless of how many 5 out of 5s you get on all your reports, because you're not being a good member of the community, and that is not optional. So
that's exactly
we'll see
how I'm
works.
doing it. There's 5 required components for me, including the About Me video. I want them all to make a little short video telling me about themselves as people. I made one that I give them, but it's so nice to be able to watch. They're so much fun to watch, and you really get to know them before they even come to class, although they'll do this after class starts. So they have to do that. They have to do the team maker. They have to do I'm doing 2 projects, so 2 peer evaluations, and they're allowed 2 free absences, and that's it.
Yep.
And
Yeah, and of course I have some free forgiveness built in of, drop the lowest this thing, miss a class for free. That's just
Sure.
reasonable, right?
Yeah.
Life happens. You can't
That's right.
always do your best for everything all the time.
That's right.
And it's out of your control.
but that's only 5, right? And I tell them
Right.
they need 90% has to be done. And of course, 1 out of 5 is worse than 90%.
Yeah.
So, I mean, and they're going to drop an entire letter grade for every one they don't do. But I'm sorry, that's what required components mean.
Yeah. Some things we have in our jobs are not optional.
Yeah. Like doing our training for grants and contracts and using our, just because they switched accounting systems, we all have to take new training.
Let's talk about that another time. I do want to offer a hot take counter argument to your point about averaging together different grade components, though. Now, I do agree that these numbers are on different scales from each other, and you can't just smush them together and assume that that's a meaningful operation. But I've been thinking a lot about linear algebra lately, getting myself ready to teach it again. And I am willing to argue that these different components of a course grade, like here's my projects, here's my exams, here's my homeworks, I do think they live in the same space. And the way I'm thinking about this is that I want the student's final grade to essentially be this total distance in a multi-dimensional phase space of student mastery of the content, where 0 is where they start and they end up hopefully in the top right corner. And that each of those different components that we're measuring, the quizzes, the exams, the projects, those are not orthogonal to each other. They are linearly independent, but if I borrow a page from differential geometry here, the metric for this space is not necessarily giving equal weights to the different dimensions of this measurement. And so what I think we're trying to accomplish, maybe a little ham-fistedly, with this weighted average system is to say, how do I try to understand the total distance that my students have traveled from their starting point? And if I understand the relative directions and the relative magnitudes of distances in the different directions in the space, maybe I can come up with some way to define a distance metric that is meaningful.
So let me, I totally agree with you. I'd say it a little more succinctly. You have all of these grades, right? All of these marks that you've given. If you use percentages and just apply it, the problem is that that's not a basis set.
Right.
You need to find the basis set that's meaningful so you can actually define your metric. And so if you make marks that are, say, satisfactory or whatever, then you've made those that are mutually independent of all the other marks. So you can create a metric in a new space with all those marks as a basis set for that metric. But it's important to recognize that if you have mixed units, right, you're not going to get
there's covariance
the right,
between these variables.
Right. And so you have to separate out what's pure about each one and
Do a
then
little
construct
Gram-Schmidt.
a space that you can then get a metric for. So I am, when you do this grading table, that's kind of what I'm doing. It'll be interesting. Hopefully, I'm going to send Robert Talbert, because I don't know David Clark. I know Robert. I'm going to ask him if he'll come on our podcast, and
Oh, that'll be fun.
we can ask him about this, because he's a mathematician, so he'll be able to.
But we might get what we ask for, though. That's the danger here.
That's right. But it's what you're saying. I totally agree with, and you do want a metric. I mean, diffraction, right? That's the metric tensor. That is such a beautiful concept, because without it, you end up with 14 different equations for what is the distance of planes in every different kind of Bravais lattice. But if you use the metric tensor, it's this beautiful little one-line thing, because it's all embedded there, because they know the interrelationships between all those different kinds of unit cells. So it's kind of like all of these different assessments are like a different kind of unit cell.
Interesting.
And how can you represent this in a simpler conceptual underpinning? And I think you said it beautifully. You're looking for a metric, a length in a space that makes sense to put all these different assessments into. And
Well,
I'd even bet that Robert Talbot thought of that first and then dumped it down for the rest of us to just say it's like averaging zip codes.
Well, we'll see how that shakes out when we have an episode on the topic.
So
There was something else I wanted to come back to, though,
Okay.
because you made this point about your grad student being the one who said, "Hey, why don't we do this for the final exam?" So the last stroke of genius, I'll pat myself on the back here, in the way I'm developing this class is I'm having undergraduate students help me develop the class, not grad students.
Right.
The students who are only 1 year ahead of the students taking this class are the ones helping me build it.
Right.
And so they are the most accurate source of information I can have to what the actual state of the students coming into this class is going to be like, what sort of experiences they had, what they really wish they had known a year ago that they had to suffer without. And they're, our students are so community oriented. It's wonderful. They are so invested in saying, how can I help my peers avoid the problems that I just had to suffer through unnecessarily?
Yeah,
There's some
it's
necessary
really-
suffering that you have to do to get good at things.
Yep.
But what is the waste and what is the lost time that could have been avoided and used for more productive things? So having these undergrad students, like, they're helping me create homework assignments. They are even doing things like reading the syllabus and saying, am I crazy here? Does this make sense? And
Are you
they're an
paying
honest
them?
sounding board. Oh yeah. So they're being hired by the department as instructional aides, and course
that's
development
great.
is one of the tasks that they
So
can
I
do.
use instructional aids as well, but they're not going to start working for me till the first day of class. So I didn't have, I should have probably hired them to do this, but you're in a different situation. You're creating something entirely new.
Yeah.
And, but I'm still I think that's a really good thing to do. So I will be asking my IAs for lots of feedback because I can change things.
Mm-hmm.
Students don't mind a change if it's to their benefit.
Right.
So we'll see. So what kind of problems are you anticipating having?
Well, there's the known knowns, the known unknowns, and however else that goes. So the biggest problem I'm anticipating is me not being calibrated difficulty-wise. That some of these things that I throw out there are going to be way too easy or way too hard, and it's just going to take a round or two of iteration on this course to find the right level to teach this stuff at.
Right.
So I fully expect that to be one of the biggest challenges this semester.
So you use CAPME. Did you get an email from the university's lawyer like I did?
I did not. I actually don't use CAPME. I use an internal tool for team assessment stuff.
Tandem?
Yeah, that's right.
You should get the same letter for that. So
I'll
Tandem
keep an
and
eye out.
CAPME. Well, I mean, I was shocked. This only happened a week ago. I got a letter from the general counsel of the University of Michigan saying, we understand you use CAPME. You must understand you are no longer allowed to use the, in the questionnaire for the team builder, what is your race? What is your gender? And they use that in tandem too. And of course,
Yeah.
this is very upsetting to me because we're not using this to exclude anyone. We're using this to make stronger teams and to make sure that we don't strand a woman on a team of men, because there's lots more men usually than women in our classes. And it's very upsetting, but it's all because of Proposition 2 in the state of Michigan. And even though the wording is not terribly clear, and I don't believe this violates any of it, the university is worried about litigation trolls who are just looking for opportunities to sue the university and make money. And they don't even have a political or ethical or moral stake in the game. They just want to make money.
Right.
It's disgusting.
Well,
Right. This is not
we'll see
for
how that shakes out.
admission. This is about just spreading
helping
people
students
out.
have the most productive experience possible in the courses that
Exactly.
we're teaching, because that's what they're here for, is to have productive learning experiences.
Right. So if you haven't gotten that, you probably will.
All right.
Or it might be because it's the university's tool, they might have just already removed it.
Yeah, I'll have to look. Well, so in your class, I feel like you've got the logistics of your class pretty well worked out at this point, of how you're
Yeah.
doing all of the timing of everything and how you're building the student teams, delivering all the
Yep.
information, activities. So are there challenges outside of the grading sphere that you're expecting this semester because of the other changes you're making?
To make sure I don't get in that situation, our department chair is a wonderful person.
Agreed.
I talked to her and said, I'm really going to make a lot of pretty deep changes. Can I please teach a smaller section? And so I'm only going to teach 40 students. And they gave me Chrysler 133. So that's an opportunity to finally have 10 teams of 4. I think 4 is a much better number than 6.
Way
I
better.
can crowd them in, but I'm very worried about the oral exam part of this and how I'm going to do that. So I feel, at least for this term, going down to smaller teams, which makes people more accountable, and also seeing if I can do oral exams for a smaller number of students. So I'll still have one instructional aid for every 2 teams. So I'll still have 5 instructional aides and 1 GSI. And that's going to really help me, because I do anticipate a lot of difficulty with this many changes for such an already complicated class.
Right. Well, let's hope it goes well. Our time to get ready is rapidly diminishing, and we've been at this for a while, so maybe we
Yes.
should wrap it up here and get back to real work.
All right. Well, I'm hoping that we can actually once a month take one of the modules in your class and find some people external to our university to talk about how they teach it. Actually, if we get Robert Talbert on, he'd be great to talk about some of the things that you're teaching, because he does that all the time. And, I'd like to reach out. And if anyone listening to this wants to volunteer to talk about a chapter like phase diagrams, phase transformations, I'd love to talk to somebody about electrochemistry, because, Bill's book doesn't really cover batteries. It's still very corrosion first. But electrochemistry is so important in material science now. And I wish there was more on batteries in there. So if anyone wants to volunteer, we'd love to have you. If you're listening to this, please look at the show notes and fill out the form where we're looking for feedback, suggestions of speakers. We want to make this as useful as we can to the materials education community.
That's right. And there's no well-defined standards for materials education podcasts for us to meet. So we are building this plane as we fly it. We would love to hear from you about what we can do to make this useful to you, dear audience.
All right. Well, thank you. And,
All right. Thanks, everyone, and we'll see you next time on the next episode of Undercool.